Very briefly. I want to first begin, though, by saying thank you to all of you for being here this afternoon. I think this has been a very rich exchange. It's certainly been very helpful and illuminating for me. I've gained a lot of tremendous insights from hearing your questions and comments. Certainly, once again, I have great appreciation and thanks to all of our panelists who have been here and shared their insights and experiences. We've all obviously benefited from that. I have to express my disappointment that that the Department of Foreign Affairs and the government both failed to send somebody here to not only to participate but to learn, to listen. I find it very disappointing that Foreign Affairs couldn't at a minimum find one person who would even just sit in the audience today and learn and hear this from this rich exchange, given the importance of the Canada-Ethiopia relationship. It is what it is, but that's a source of considerable disappointment and obviously underscores the work. There's work for us on many fronts, but certainly that is one, because it can't stand as that. I'm going to just share a few thoughts on the human rights front, and then I think Aklelu will pick up some of the broader issues, perhaps around democracy and the political situation. Seems to me that there's maybe four main categories or themes that emerged for me as I was hearing our human rights discussion unfold throughout the course of the afternoon. The first, I think, is the big overarching one, that it's time for a new attitude and a new stance for Canada, for the international community when it comes to engaging with Ethiopia around human rights issues, that it can no longer be this business as usual approach of sort of ignoring or turning a blind eye to what is by now a incredibly well-documented pattern of worsening human rights concerns going back several years now, and that it can no longer be this time of Ethiopia getting a free ride when it comes to this growing list of very serious human rights concerns, and that new attitude, that new stance needs to play out with, we need to see visible and meaningful and often concerted bilateral pressure, one-on-one pressure that's being exerted and brought to bear in a variety of multilateral settings. We have a number of different, I think throughout the course of the day we heard references to the G8, the G20, the UN, UNESCO. We had quite a number of multilateral bodies that came up, and that needs to really start to intensify. And that I think that what needs to infuse this new attitude and this new approach with Ethiopia is this sense of there must be space for human rights. Of course, what we're seeing is exactly the opposite, curtailing and cutting back that space, but that there must be space for human rights activists to work, space for people to exercise their human rights, and that needs to become the primary focus of the international community. So that's sort of the big overarching theme I kept hearing. A second is that, I guess flowing from that then is that it's time to really develop then the human rights agenda that the Canadian government in its dealings, but in also working with other international actors, will really be starting to press. And a lot of it is the kind of conventional human rights advocacy and demands that we hope and expect to see from the international community when faced with a country with a record like Ethiopia's, but which we haven't been. So consistent, forceful demands that prisoners of conscience are being released, concerted action to ensure that religious freedom is being upheld, real attention to law reform concerns such as the Charities and Societies Proclamation, the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation, institutional issues like judicial independence, really concerted efforts to ensure there's ongoing and very serious trial monitoring of human rights defenders and others. So really developing that, as I say, that sort of that conventional human rights agenda that we want to see in place in so many instances, but because of this go soft, go quiet approach with Ethiopia, just has not been, at best, it's been occasional and inconsistent, at worst, non-existent. The third area that I've certainly heard a lot of issues around was aid and development assistance, and there I think was kind of two dimensions. There were a number of things said about how important it is that we ensure that, again, I guess focusing particularly on Canada, but not only, more broadly the international community, that we're pushing for aid and development assistance that will do good on the human rights front, so that will be supporting strong possibilities for human rights defenders, that will be focusing on judicial capacity building, and there'd be a long list of the kinds of things we want to see being done well with respect to that aid and development assistance. But the second piece, and I think this is actually where we heard more and heard about it very helpfully in Felix's presentation, is aid and development assistance that doesn't do harm. And how troubling and problematic that is, and how we've really got to be pressing for governments to get a handle on that, and that we start to see due diligence in how they're moving forward with their aid and development assistance. We certainly cannot let Ethiopia get away with this sort of scornful attitude to the inspection panel at the World Bank, and the villagization concerns need to be taken seriously, etc., etc. And then the last, not so much that we heard a lot about this, but I think as we close off a session here in Canada, we also will need to think about what are some of the perhaps Canada-specific pieces, because I think a lot of what I've probably just enumerated is something we could also say to the US government, the UK government, almost any government. And maybe we didn't have as much time to really tease a lot of that out. I'll put back on the table something I said in my opening remarks, and that is, we have a Canadian human rights case. We have Bashir Maktal in prison in Ethiopia. There may well actually be some other cases that some of you know of, relatives of people here in Canada. Some of those kind of human rights cases that have a very specific Canadian dimension, and where I think, quite frankly, to this point in time, we've been seeing pretty ineffectual efforts by the Canadian government to even rise to those cases, let alone more broadly. And then the second, and I think again we heard this from Felix, but we probably didn't have a chance to really delve into this too much, but that mining issue is something that we're going to really need to make sure that as Canadians we've got firmly on the agenda. We all know how that is now the theme that dominates every aspect of Canadian foreign policy, aid policy, you name it. It's all about mining, and Ethiopia is clearly not going to be an exception. And as that starts to take off, we're going to need to be ready to really be on top of that. What are the companies? Where are they operating? What are the concerns associated with their operations? What do we need to be saying to those companies? What do we need to be saying to the Canadian government, etc. So yeah, sort of those four broad categories. Time for a new attitude, time for a human rights agenda, let's pay attention to aid and development assistance, and let's think about the Canada-specific pieces as well. And lots more, but that's, I guess, some first impressions on the human rights front. And I'll pass the torch to you.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I think the discussion that took place has been covered well. I would say some of the few elements that I think need a bit of emphasis were there's just a clear indication that within Ethiopia currently, EPRDF completely Ethiopia is under an authoritarian rule, regime. And there was mention also about when we talk about EPRDF, let's be conscious that we're really talking mainly about the dominant TPLF, which is behind all of this. So that kind of understanding has to be very crystal clear. But that says a lot about the policies and the driving of the agendas within the country. The complete politicization of the legal system, therefore the absence of rule of law, it has been highly emphasized. There was quite a bit of points raised that even after the days of Meles Zenawi, the new government is also continuing in the same path as did Meles for the last 22 years, very sadly and very disappointingly, because there was at least some expectation. There might be some change or hope for a little bit of movement in that regard, but what we see is more intensified repression than any change at all. There was a lot of clarity brought to the discussion about villagization and how that is really affecting communities, destroying communities. The issue of forced eviction based on ethnicity, which is almost close, or some people would say, to ethnic cleansing, which are really very, very disturbing situations that have arisen in the last little while. There's a lot of discussion also about security and democracy, and there was, I think, a clear understanding that the concept of security and democracy are intertwined, and without assuring democracy, empowerment, and participation, you cannot guarantee security. You may have temporarily some kind of situation that seems stable, but the situation in Ethiopia, as it really clearly shows, from time to time the security situation is deteriorating, therefore affecting not only Ethiopia, maybe the region, and possibly internationally too. There was a lot of discussion about religious persecution in Ethiopia also, both on Muslim and Christian community, which really also goes to the destruction of some of the monasteries in Ethiopia, which needs a serious attention. There was mention about recently observed mass movement, both from the Muslim community particularly, which might provide some hope, but there was also a balance to say that such movements alone, without political support, may not really yield the result of democratization in the end. Therefore, there has to be there's a little bit of a positive movement in terms of the actions taken by the Blue Party in the last little while, which shows that political parties could also mobilize people in Ethiopia and play a very prominent part. So what that shows me is it's a combined effort of both the mass movement and political movements that could really galvanize the public and maybe lead us into the democratization in Ethiopia. There was a lot of emphasis in almost every speaker about the need for some kinds of concern about where this thing is leading. And if it's not really curtailed in time, the abuse of human rights and the other forms of suppression could lead into a very serious crisis situation. To avert that, and the best alternative, as repeatedly shown by a number of speakers, is maybe to look for an opportunity for a national dialogue. There's a number of scenarios that were presented that could lead into some kind of initiation of a serious national dialogue in Ethiopia, and I'm hoping that those will be really the best alternatives for the country. I guess in terms of Canadian response, again, as Alex was saying, Canada and the donor community have to be very active in promoting human rights and institutionalizing democracy in Ethiopia, and they have to be more assertive in the demand that the Ethiopian government be accountable to the support that it is receiving from the Western donor nations. Thank you very much, and that's my thought for the day.
I want to just say two final words of thank you. First, I don't know if you've all been noticing, but we've had some valiant translators working here on the side for us throughout the afternoon, and still one lowly person holding vigil for us. So thank you very much for being here. And I just would really like to express my appreciation to my good friends with the Solidarity Committee for Ethiopian Political Prisoners Canada. It's been great working with both Solomon and with Akilu to make sure that we had a great event this afternoon, and look forward to ongoing collaboration, certainly with the organization and with the community more widely.
And I also want to thank Amnesty International for a great effort, and they've been partner with us for many years. I look forward to ongoing relationship and partnership. Of course, the situation in Ethiopia is getting worse, not better at this point, so a lot of collaboration, I guess, is required. And thank you to everyone that came here today, both as presenters and participants, and I really appreciate it. It's a very busy time, and thank you for taking the time. I just want to mention, there's a note that was given to me as part of my summary. I think I forgot to mention that it's part of the mechanism for dialogue and reconciliation. Make EPRDF part of the solution also, to get out of its own created mess. That's what it is. So creating that reconciliation and dialogue, and creating, of course, dialogue and reconciliation is the meeting mind of opposite camps. Okay, thank you.
And thank you, David Lord, who's been toiling in the back of the room as our valiant rapporteur for this afternoon. I don't envy him the task, but his efforts are much appreciated.
Just to mention here about አማርኛ ለምትሰሙ ታላቅ የተቃውሞ ሰላማዊ ሰልፍ በካናዳዋ ከተማ ዋና ከተማ ኦታዋ፣ ቶሮንቶ አካባቢ፣ ሃሚልተን፣ ለንደን፣ ቶሮንቶ የመጡ ሰዎች በደረጃው ወያኔ አገዛዝ የዘር ማጥፋት ዓላማ በአኟዋክ፣ በበደኖ፣ በኦጋዴን፣ በሙስሊም፣ በኦሮሞ ወዘተ የተፈጸመውን አሁን ደግሞ በጉራ ፈርዳ በቤኒሻንጉል ጉሙዝ የሚገኙ አማሮች ላይ እየተፈጸመ ያለውን የዘር ማጥፋት ወንጀልና ግድያ በጎንደር፣ በአፋርና በጋምቤላ ወዘተ ህዝቡ ለዘመናት ከነበረበት ቀዬ በግፍ ለማፈናቀል ለመሬቱን ለውጭ ከበርቴ ለሚሸጥ ኦርቶዶክስና ሙስሊም ሃይማኖት ጉዳይ ጣልቃ መግባትን እየፈጸመ ያለውን ከፍተኛ ሰብአዊ መብት ጥሰት በመቃወም ታላቅ ሰላማዊ ሰልፍ ይደረጋል። መቼ? ዌንስዴይ ጁን 5 12 PM ኑን ላይ ማለት ነው። In front of Ottawa City Hall, Ottawa, Ontario. ስለዚህ ነገ 12 ነው ዴሞንስትሬሽን ይኖራል።
Thank you.